I've had patients over the years come to me with interstitial cystitis, and their stories are almost the same. Years and years of no diagnosis or misdiagnoses. And then when they get the diagnosis, treatment failure after treatment failure after treatment failure, the costs, the discomfort, the pain that they've had, and the frustration is horrible. I met a woman, a nurse practitioner, Ruth Kriz, at a conference a few months ago, and she opened my eyes to a new approach to interstitial cystitis. And her story is amazing of how she came to become an expert in this. And her approach is really phenomenal that gets women finally the results they need. So I'm excited to share with you her information and you learn about her because if you have this or you know somebody who has this, they need to know this approach. So Ruth, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You shared with me your story, and if you're comfortable with that about interstitial cystitis and how you came to focus on this, I would love for you to share that with the listeners.
Oh, I would love to share. Many years ago, when I was in my early 30s, I started having urinary tract infections, and they were just treated like you treat any UTI with a short course of antibiotics. And it seemed to help initially, but then these became more and more frequent. And finally, it got to the point where I was constantly having urinary symptoms, getting up nights to urinate, felt this uncomfortable pressure 24/7, and went to many different doctors who at first said, "Oh, you have urethritis." And then they said, "Oh, well, you have trigonitis." And the trigone area of the bladder is sort of that funnel shaped place where the urethra attaches to the bladder. And then I was told I had interstitial cystitis and told me it was chronic, degenerative, and incurable. Well, this continued to progress to where my symptoms were chronic pain for 6 years, and I felt like I had been failed by the medical profession. And if they weren't going to give me answers, I was going to start looking for them myself. And this started a long journey where at first I was working with a PhD microbiologist. We were using broth urine cultures. We were finding pathogens that the standard cultures were not finding. And for me, that was really good news because if you find something that's a pathogen, something that causes disease, then you can treat it and fix it. And it took me a couple of years, but gradually my urinary symptoms resolved, and I've now been symptom free for, over 40 years. And
Amazing. That's
this
phenomenal.
has been quite a journey because I learned that there's a whole lot more to this condition and which patients are more likely to develop it and what those factors are and how to correct those factors. So I believe anybody that's received an IC diagnosis now can be cured with the proper testing and treatment.
Now, when you were looking at this and going through this initially, how long did it take you to even get that IC diagnosis?
7 years.
Wow. And that's normal, right? That's average, as I understand, or
Yeah, that was about 7 years to get that diagnosis. And then another 4 years to get things resolved with trying to figure this out on my own.
you told me before there are tens of thousands of potential pathogens, right? I mean, I think that 60,000. Tell us about that because that's an incredible number.
Well, it's the testing that can now be done is through a company that has 60,000 pathogens in their database. However, when they did a study of 157,000 IC patients, and we used to be able to mark whether they had that diagnosis or not on the order form, they found close to 5,800 different bacteria. And so potentially, sure, 60,000, but the reality is it's probably closer to 6,000 different bacteria that more advanced molecular testing can find that traditional culturing and even the limited test menu of a PCR test is never going to be able to identify.
So it sounds like the underlying cause is an infection, and the looking at, so tell people, because they may not know, what's the difference between the kind of traditional or standard method of microbiology looking to determine if there are any pathogens there with a urine sample versus what you're talking about.
Certainly. About 150 years ago, the latest and greatest technology was a culture. And it first started out in a nutrient broth like soy, and then they progressed to doing a culture plate that typically is made from agar, a type of seaweed or derived from seaweed. And in order for bacteria that's in something like urine to grow, a small sample of it gets put on the culture plate. The culture plate is put in an incubator, which, by the way, is about 1 degree below normal body temperature. Um, and you wait 24 hours and you see what grows. Well, this has a number of problems. First of all, we're only recovering the bacteria that are free floating in the urine at the time. And we're going to talk a little bit more, I hope, about biofilms and the fact that if it's
Absolutely.
not free floating at the time but is embedded in a biofilm, you'll never get it in the urine sample to find it to begin with. Um, Secondly, the culture media itself is going to favor the growth of E. coli. Literature says, oh, 90% of urinary tract infections are caused by E. coli. Well, that's not really quite the case, because when they did more advanced molecular testing, the predominant infection, at least in this chronic population, only 28% of the time was at E. coli. And so they're really missing those other bacteria that aren't growing on the culture plate, either because it isn't the right culture medium. These are slow growing bacteria that even have had a chance to start growing after 24 hours, or they're anaerobic, meaning they don't need, they can flourish without oxygen, and sometimes if you expose them to oxygen, they aren't going to be happy and they die. And if you're putting something on a culture plate in the open air in a lab, the anaerobic bacteria are not the ones that you're going to find. You're only going to find the ones that can flourish in the presence of oxygen. We also have the problem of cell wall deficient bacteria. People who have been on long courses of antibiotics or repeated short courses without sufficient breaks for the bacteria to recover sometimes can be driven into a cell wall deficient form, and those don't grow on standard urine culture plates. So right away, the culturing methodology is missing a lot of pathogens that like to reside in a bladder. When we talk about molecular testing, we're talking about two types. The first is polymerase chain reaction, PCR. You may have heard that term with the COVID testing. And we know that that's very accurate. It's sensitive. You don't have to have special handling. And it doesn't depend on a lot of those variables that we find with the culture methodology. It can find the DNA of the bacteria or the fungus that's there. It doesn't matter whether that bacteria is aerobic, it likes oxygen, or anaerobic, doesn't like oxygen. It doesn't matter if it's slow growing or not. It doesn't depend on the culture medium that's used, and it will find the cell wall deficient forms. The second type of molecular testing is called next generation sequencing. So whereas with PCR, you have to develop a primer. So you've already decided in advance what bacteria you think you're going to find. The equipment can only test for 48 pathogens at a time. I'm sorry, 24 pathogens at a time. There is one company doing 48. And they selected that bacteria based on what they commonly find on urine cultures. And so when you have a primer, you run the DNA sequencing, that stretch of DNA has to adhere to the primer, and then you have a hit. The problem with this is it's so specific that if I make a primer for Enterococcus faecalis and you have Enterococcus faecium, it won't match. You make a
It's
primer
got to
for
match the
Klebs.
species, not just the genus. And so you're
Right,
missing a
right.
lot. And it has, and they've made their tests based on what's found in the urine on culture, and what you've just shared with us is that that is really not very specific or sensitive. It misses, probably most of the problem, and so there's no
Oh,
way, it's impossible with that testing to get an accurate diagnosis, it sounds like, of what's going on, and that's why the PCR testing is a better way to go.
well, the PCR is definitely a better way to go, but the problem once again is it cannot test for enough pathogens. If we were
Oh, I see.
finding 5,800 pathogens with next generation sequencing and you're only testing for 24 or maybe 48 with PCR, you're still missing the vast majority of what's really
So what
causing
is
the
the best
problem.
test for this?
Well, that's where the one company in the world that's doing testing for enough pathogens, the 60,000 pathogens, is Microgen DX. And this company they do two levels of testing. They first do the PCR, and this will also check for 17 different resistance genes. But then there's a level two testing in which they use next generation sequencing. And the way this is different from PCR is that instead of having a primer for each pathogen you want to check for, they simply have a library. Think of the FBI. You get a fingerprint and you send it off to the FBI. They run their computer and look for a match. That's exactly what they're doing at Microgen DX with the sequence they get, the molecular DNA of the bacteria. They then take an extra 3 to 5 days to ferociously run those computers and see if they can find a match in their database of over 60,000 pathogens. And the other advantage is that it's also looking for fungal species, 34,000 of them, as well as bacteria. And unfortunately, in the commercial labs, if something grows out that's fungal on a urine culture plate, they report it as contaminated. Whereas in this chronic population, there can be numerous fungi that are part of that biofilm structure. And those fungal infections can make people every bit as symptomatic as the bacteria.
You mentioned biofilm just now, and you mentioned it a few minutes ago too. So tell people what that is, because they can get tested and treated, but that's not the end of the story.
Right. Um, the father of biofilms, Bill Costerton, um, worked for the oil industry, and he was one of the original microbiologists at the Biofilm Research Center, funded by the oil industry. Turns out that they had petroleum degrading bacteria in their oil pipes, and they were not happy about that. So they established this institute, and he was one of the microbiologists that discovered this slime coating inside the pipes that was adhered to the wall that was harboring these petroleum degrading bacteria. And he named this slime biofilm. Well, lo and behold, oil pipes are not the only thing in our universe that can develop biofilms. People also can have biofilms, only in people it's not slime. There's actually 5 different types of biofilms that people can get. And one of the types that's involved with why people get chronic infections is that the pathogen they have is making its own biofilm. So some bacteria make their own biofilm, some do not. The most famous example of this is H. pylori. H. pylori, that causes stomach ulcers, makes its own biofilm. So, in addition to the antibiotics, if you want good treatment, you have to use the right biofilm disruptor along with the antibiotics so the antibiotics can actually get to where the bacteria are being harbored inside this three-dimensional structure. The other type of biofilm that is very common in the chronic UTI IC population is actually made by the person. This is the fibrin type of biofilm. Fibrin is generated through the coagulation pathway. Things that can trigger that are mold or tick-borne infections or a person's genetics. And if you're one of the 20% of the population worldwide that has one of four different genetic variations or mutations, then you are either making too much fibrin or you don't break it down efficiently. And that, if you get an infection, is a recipe for that infection becoming chronic.
And that is also part of the blood clotting cascade as well. Fibrinogen and fibrin. That's part of those are in blood clots. So is there any connection between you and I actually haven't talked about this before. I just made this connection between blood clotting and biofilms and interstitial cystitis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mentioned that 20% of the general population genetically has one of those issues. But in my chronic UTI and IC population, I found one of those four genetic problems 70% of the time.
Wow.
And so there's a huge correlation. These are people who will have in their lifetime more chronic infections. And this doesn't necessarily even have to be a bladder infection. It could be prostatitis, it could be sinus infections, it could be difficulty with wound healing. Even acne is a biofilm problem. So there's lots of ways in which people can have one of these genetics and it resulting in a chronic infection. This also contributes to miscarriages, preeclampsia, and cardiovascular disease. So most everybody in my patient population, unless this extra fibrin was being triggered by mold toxins or a tick-borne infection or other environmental factors, most everybody in the chronic infection population with these genetics have a family history of cardiovascular disease. They got these genetics from parents, grandparents. It's been passed down to them, and that's simply the genetic hand that they were dealt. But it can be normalized, and that fibrin can be broken down so that now the antibiotics will work. And that's one of the other problems is if we continue to treat the chronic UTI or the IC person as if they are having repeated acute episodes, they aren't going to be treated long enough, nor are they going to be treated with the correct biofilm disruptor so that the antibiotics can work and eventually get rid of these infections. They didn't get here overnight. We're not going to fix it overnight. It's not going to be a one and done.
So the approach is then test, kill the infection using, what do you use? Antibiotics, natural products? What's your approach?
Um, I wish that quote unquote natural products would work. Even with breaking down the biofilms based on the pathogens that are found and their genetics, it seems as if we cannot get rid of these infections without the antibiotics. We can keep people healthy once we've gotten rid of them, but once they've been harbored in these biofilms, sometimes for not just years, but decades, we just need a more aggressive approach. But it is a targeted approach. We're not just throwing antibiotics at somebody, crossing our fingers and hoping they're going to work, because the ones that might work for an acute infection generally are not the ones that we need to use for chronic infections embedded in the biofilms.
And so
And
you
they absolutely, you
so
know,
you treat for a while and then you retest.
you got it exactly. People start biofilm disrupting the week before they ever submit a urine specimen. And when those results come back, it's a very different approach than most practitioners are used to using. It's not unusual for us to see multiple pathogens and often multi-drug resistance coming back even on that first test. When you see multiple pathogens and multi-drug resistance, that's the big giveaway that we have a biofilm problem. We picked the most prevalent pathogen because that's the one giving the person the most symptoms, and that's the one we target. We intentionally do not go after the little ones. These reports from NGS come back as low, medium, or high total bacterial load, and then each pathogen is listed with the percentage of which was found. So if I have the first one I find is coming back at 52%, and the next one at 19%, and the next one at 8%, and the next one at 3%, and maybe there's a couple other ones at lower percentages. There is no one and done. We only focus on the predominant one because if we expose those low percentage ones to an antibiotic when the vast majority of them are still embedded in the biofilm, the most likely result will be we've just created more drug resistant strains. So we continue working on the biofilms. We do not stop until that person is done. And if they have certain genetics, they may need to stay on a biofilm disruptor the rest of their lives to normalize their body's ability to break down the extra fibrin or to dampen the amount of fibrin they produce. It's a process. People get the testing done. They're on an antibiotic for 2 weeks. After a week, when they finish, they retest whether they're symptomatic or not. Takes about a week for the results to come back. We see who the next big pathogen is, and we go after that one. So this process is about 2 weeks on an antibiotic, 2 weeks off. And during that time, if there's any cell wall deficient bacteria, they have had time to revert back to having a cell wall because about 98% of antibiotics work on cell walls. And then their gut also has time to replenish and restore the healthy lactobacilli, although I will say oftentimes the antibiotic choices we make are based on which ones will or will not disrupt the gut flora.
That's fantastic. I love how targeted the approach is. Historically, it's just been a shotgun approach of really broad spectrum, trying to treat whatever they think might be there, but with no data really to support that. So your approach is a lot more logical, and more importantly, it's getting patients results. So when you and I met, I mentioned one case of IC that I saw, and that's the only one that I've ever seen or treated. I've referred out for everything, and it was just supportive. In this, what I learned in school was don't give vitamin C because it can exacerbate the symptoms. And I told you that, and I was really surprised what you taught me and grateful for what you shared with me. So if people are still getting that recommendation, what's the research show now of is that a good recommendation? Does it not matter? What do you think?
Well, recommendations are oftentimes invented. The problem with someone who has a damaged bladder wall from these chronic infections is that vitamin C, ascorbic acid, not the buffered form, but the ascorbic acid form, is really very acidic and very painful. It's the same reason why people benefit from the IC diet. It usually limits acidic foods and fermented foods that trigger histamine responses. Years ago, when bladder biopsies were done, we looked for mast cells on the biopsy tissue. Mast cells pump out histamines, and therefore people with IC who stay away from histamines and acidic foods have their bladder doesn't flare as much and they're more comfortable, but that's only symptom management. To go back to your question about the ascorbic acid recommendation, let me back up one other piece of information. What I found is that most of these people have another genetic issue in one of the enzymes involved in making cysteine and taurine in the body. Instead of making cysteine and taurine, they make a lot of ammonia. Also, if they have Lyme disease, ammonia is an exotoxin of Lyme. This extra ammonia has to be cleared by the urea cycle, how you make urine in the bladder, and this ammonia concentrates in the bladder overnight because our pituitary gland puts out antidiuretic hormone. Well, so this high ammonia starts getting very concentrated and sitting in the bladder all night long. Studies have shown that ammonia damages the gag layer. That's the important lining of the bladder wall. And that's your definition of an IC patient in a nutshell. Not only does it damage the bladder wall, but the ammonia raises the urine pH, and that causes a whole lot of bacteria that we very commonly find on these microgen reports to flourish. Enterococcus is a big player. I was finding that 90% of the time is the last guy standing in my patients. So how do we fix this? Here's where other supplements besides antibiotics are crucial if we're going to win the bug wars. Ornithine is used by the body to clear out the extra ammonia. There's a lovely product called Ammonia Scavenger, and it helps the body clear the extra ammonia. People take as much as they need so that their first morning urine pH is not higher than 6.0. Well, instead of seeing Enterococcus now 95% of the time, I now see it less than 5% of the time. So by clearing the ammonia, we're stopping the bladder wall damage, and we're getting the urine pH down to where those pathogens that flourish at that high pH no longer have a happy home. So even though vitamin C might lower the pH, it's not clearing the ammonia, it's not stopping the damage to the bladder wall. And I have some concerns about ammonia NH3 with nitrogen actually helping to feed the bacteria. I got to do more research on that one, but this has been a huge game changer right there. We also have other bacteria that like to flourish that aren't as pH sensitive, and lo and behold, good studies coming out of NIH, particularly using the supplement taurine to help clear ammonia, Klebsiella. So here are these people making too much ammonia. They're not making enough taurine. Supplementing the taurine will help their gut clear from Klebsiella so it doesn't keep reinfecting their bladder. So there are a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and it's not just the right antibiotic once you have that microgen testing. And I also wanted to mention there is a LabCorp panel that will identify what those genetic problems are and can quantify how much fibrin a person is making in real time.
Your approach is so sophisticated and unique to each patient, which is one of the things that I think is so phenomenal, because we know each patient coming in, may be struggling with very different underlying, mixture of bacteria or fungi that are causing these problems, or genetic issues and challenges. So having this very individualized, personalized approach is what should be the standard of care, but unfortunately, it's not. And this approach, though, can people learn more? I mean, let's say you're on the East Coast and you're not seeing patients. You're doing tremendous other work, teaching, consulting, and helping get the word out about this and educate practitioners as well as patients. But let's say people, they want to find somebody who can do this for them. How do they go about doing that?
Great question. I have a website, ruthkriz.com. And on that website, there's a tab that says provider selection. It will give you a drop-down menu with the different states in the United States, as well as a number of countries where I have practitioners who have been individually trained by me and consult with me on a regular basis. And these practitioners are listed by states where they are licensed. that may not be the same state where they're physically located, but they can do telemedicine with patients in those states because they carry a license there. And so if you want to explore this for yourself, chronic urinary tract infections, um, interstitial cystitis, chronic prostatitis, those are the practitioners who will know what tests you need, have accounts with Microgen DX or order them through the professional co-op. They have LabCorp accounts and can order my custom panel. I'll just give a plug for that here called, its test number is 505443. That is not on the LabCorp website, but practitioners with an account can put it in through the LabCorp link system. They can put their number in the EMR. They can order that through the professional co-op and get that critical testing done so you will know why you have biofilms from the fibrin formation. The one other piece that I want to bring out with lab testing is vitamin D. It turns out that your body uses vitamin D to make cathelicidin. That's a fancy peptide manufactured by the bladder wall that helps prevent urinary tract infections. Virtually 100% of my people that I was able to see genetics on through the old 23andMe testing from years ago, and 156 patients gave me their data. 100% of them had a vitamin D receptor mutation. And so their bodies were making vitamin D sufficiently, but not holding on to it. So that's another factor in which they are not able to fight urinary tract infections and will always need to supplement vitamin D to keep their levels above 50. The reference range of 30 to 100, I don't believe, because they didn't throw out of the normal reference range everybody with his VDR mutation. So I think if you can get your vitamin D level above 50, if you can get on the proper biofilm disruptors, based on the pathogens found with advanced molecular testing and your own genetics for making and breaking down fibrin, now the antibiotics are going to work. We don't need more higher tech, fancier, bigger gun antibiotics. My experience is that the same ones that we've always used work beautifully once you break down the biofilms appropriately.
Amazing. And just to be clear, your website is Ruth Kriz, RuthKriz.com. Phenomenal resources there. And that LabCorp test number is 505443. Did I get that correct?
Correct,
And
correct.
I'm gonna add that to the show notes too for people, so it'll be down there. Thank you so much for sharing this and helping people understand what they can do. Anything you want to just mention before we go wrapping up? Maybe something we didn't touch on. Any final words?
Um, I want people to have hope. You have probably been told that, well, you're just somebody that's always going to get urinary tract infections, or, well, you have IC and the best we can do is help manage your symptoms. And I want people out there hearing this podcast to know that we can do better, that you can find out what bacteria are causing your problems. There are tests that will find that bacteria that are better than a standard culture, and that once you identify what's causing the problem, it can be treated, your bladder wall will repair, and you can go the rest of your life without ever having another urinary tract infection or an interstitial cystitis symptom if you stay on the supplements that are going to help your body prevent those infections from coming back.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing with me today and being here.
It's been a delight. Thank you.